Help me welcome from the Leicester University, Farida Vis.
Thank you very much. Okay, reading the riots on Twitter. So I just want to briefly say a few things for those of you who don't know what happened in detail last summer in the United Kingdom. It started on the 4th of August when a man was shot in Tottenham. His name was Mark Duggan, and he was shot by the police. And he was shot under very suspect circumstances that were never really fully cleared up. And his family at the time really was looking for answers that they didn't get from the police. And so on the Saturday after his death, a number of family members and community members went to the police station in Tottenham to seek answers to what had happened. And they didn't get anywhere. Nobody would speak to them. And so they were there as a group of people from the community as well. And nobody would speak to them. No senior police officer addressed them. They left around 9 o'clock, at which point the tension in the area was really mounting and sort of tipped over. So the family went home and the tension really tipped over, and that's really when the spark of the riot started with the burning of 2 police cars in Tottenham. This led to further widespread looting in the Tottenham area, and this is one of the images that you may remember if you followed this at all on the news. And this is certainly one of the images that I vividly remember when I followed the news on Twitter and just had this awful feeling in my stomach thinking this is just going to blow up beyond proportion, particularly to do with the circumstances of his death. And it did. The next day in London, it spread. It spread to the north of London, to Enfield initially, and then also to the south, to Brixton, as well as other areas in the city. And the focus moved away slightly from clashes with the police and was now very much about looting and stealing certain items. And you may remember that one of the stores in particular that was hit very heavily was Foot Locker. And Foot Locker seems to be caught up in riots quite often, and we can think about kind of the commodity and the kind of the hyper desires people have for particular trainers, and so Foot Locker was hit very heavily during the riots. On the third day, the disorder spread to other parts of the United Kingdom, and London itself saw the worst 24 hours of civil unrest in its recent history, and 22 of the 32 boroughs in London were very negatively affected by rioting. And it's worth kind of taking a deep breath to imagine the scale of a city like London and the scale of 22 out of 32 boroughs being affected by this. On that third day, 2 people died as well, and the riots spread further across the United Kingdom to large population areas, including Birmingham, Nottingham, and Leicester. And so this was really spreading like wildfire on day 3. On day 4, things both escalated further in the north of England, so rioting spread to Salford and Manchester, where I live. But also because so much police was drafted into London in particular, there were very few incidents in the capital on that 4th day. In Birmingham, however, one of the worst events within that very short 4-day period took place when 3 young Muslim men who were protecting property were killed by a car. And a person driving deliberately into that crowd. And for those of you who followed this news on the international media or Twitter, will all remember the father of one of these young men who really stood out for his enormous strength of character for speaking against people kind of retaliating the death of his son. So, what was going on? Why were people doing this? It spread like wildfire, and nobody really had an answer, except that politicians said, well, the answer is simple. This is criminality, pure and simple. We don't need to really understand what's going on here. This is just people being criminals and looting on a mass scale. And so we weren't encouraged to think of any possible links for what might have caused the riots, so no links to poverty, no links to lack of education or social upward mobility, and certainly we mustn't think at all that this has something to do with the economic crisis. So what the government very strongly said is that there is no need for an inquiry. It was a sort of, let's move along, nothing to see here. Now, one of the things that was happening at the time is that one of the accusations that was being made or that was being proffered by people who made sort of snap kind of knee-jerk responses to what was going on is that social media was being blamed. So social media was being blamed for the worst civil unrest that England had seen in recent years. And what was happening is that the three key platforms that were being blamed were BlackBerry Messenger, which we later found out played a very, very significant role in terms of being a closed network, in terms of being a very cheap technology that particularly people from socially deprived, economically deprived backgrounds could access. So a BlackBerry handset is only about £40. You can have free messaging capacity for about £5 a month. So this was really being used. But on the pile was being thrown Facebook and Twitter as being blamed for these unrests. So who are the accusers? The usual suspects, the politicians. David Cameron was discussing whether or not people should be banned from using some of these platforms if they had been found guilty of using it for rioting purposes. And more worryingly, Louise Mensch, a Conservative MP, started making noises that were very, very troubling. And she was starting to say that social media might have to be switched off during the riots or during future events of this nature. And so we had these politicians saying, evil Egyptian dictator switching off the internet, very bad, but if we have to switch off social media for very legitimate reasons, then there's no problem here. People were getting arrested. So people were getting arrested for posting certain messages on Facebook. And one of the things that was happening is the arrests were swift, the sentencing was extremely swift and very, very harsh. So this is someone who got 4 years for posting messages on Facebook. And this is one of the cases that really got a lot of media attention. These are two young men who posted a message on Facebook trying to organize a riot in a relatively small city in the United Kingdom, Norwich. And two things happened. One, they were very unsuccessful. Nobody responded and nobody showed up, except that somebody did show up, the police, to arrest them, and they got 4 years. And they appealed their sentence, but the appeal was denied. Now, there were many people defending the rights of social media, saying the riots were not caused by social media. And one of the most interesting, I think, kind of defenders of social media was actually the police, as well as many others. And they argued that it was a vital platform for communication for them, in the sense that it allowed them to debunk rumors, it allowed them to reassure people through this mass communication platform, and they felt that it was overwhelmingly positive for them to still have access to social media, particularly Twitter. And this is the Greater Manchester Police. The quote is from the Greater Manchester Police. Greater Manchester Police is very kind of forward-thinking in terms of their social media use, and so they were very outspoken about defending it. Now, the general public, on the other hand, very much was in line with what the politicians were saying. So this is a poll that The Guardian conducted of about 1,000 people, where 70% were saying, yes, we agree that during these very particular circumstances, BBM, Facebook, and Twitter might have to be switched off. Now, the biggest support for switching off came from people who weren't typically using these platforms, so that came from people over 65. But I think it's really worth remembering that there is a general public out there that was very supportive of these measures, and so this is worth kind of bearing in mind. Now, in terms of there not being an inquiry, the Guardian newspaper said, this isn't good enough. We need to hold the government to account, and we need to find out what happened here. And so they set about setting up this groundbreaking study called Reading the Riots, which is a collaboration with the London School of Economics, funded by two different funding councils. And our project is part of this, where we looked at Twitter, and particularly what role did social media actually play in this. So Twitter was, of course, very interested in finding out, because they were being accused of something they they felt they hadn't played any part in their platform hadn't been used in this way. And so they donated a corpus of 2.6 million tweets tweeted over that 4-day period by 700,000 individual users. And what we looked at is the role of rumors. We looked at whether or not incitement actually took place on Twitter, and we wanted to look at the ways in which different users had come to prominence and were using the platform. Now, The Guardian produced a very early visualization of the different hashtags that people were using, and what you see is that people were using localized version of the riot hashtag. So the first peak is in Tottenham, then we move on to Enfield, and what happens on day 3 is that the riot cleanup hashtag really spikes all of a sudden. It's the black line. And we calculated that this was seen by potentially 7 million users at the time. And the riot cleanup account was set up in response to people kind of trying to do something about this in their own community. So people kind of going out in the streets the next mornings and kind of cleaning up the mess. And this account, within a few hours, got over 60,000 followers. And then the final peak is Manchester, when the riots came to Manchester, and the local hashtag for Manchester started to become quite big. Now, one of the things we looked at was the role of rumors, and for those of you who know, there were some really outlandish rumors flying around at the time, including that animals had been released from the London Zoo, that rioters were frying their own foods in McDonald's, that a girl had been beaten up at the start of the riots by the police, this actually happened, that the London Eye was on fire and had somehow miraculously been pushed over by the rioters, that the Birmingham Children's Hospital was under attack from rioters, that tanks had rolled into parts of London. This is actually a tank from Tahrir Square. And that Miss Selfridge, a clothes shop in Manchester, had been set on fire by the rioters, which actually also happened. So some of these rumors turned out to be true. Some of them were true. Now, the rumor that I want to look at is animals being released from the zoo. And what we did here is we coded this sort of mini corpus, this mini data set of rumors. And one of the things we were interested in is the kind of information that people were distributing about this particular rumor. So what we divided it into is the green dots, and I'm going to play you the time sequence of the rumor. The green dots are people simply repeating the rumor, people simply making the claim, tigers have been released. Then red dots show counter claims. That's not happening. People might give reasons. Yellow dots show that people are asking questions. Have tigers been released? Is this true? And then people also start commenting. So this rumor plays out over a 4-hour period. And what you see is that in the first instance, people simply repeat the claim and also ask, is this true? Is this happening? And so we see this claim being repeated, and the size of the bubbles denote that they are repeated more often. But what you start seeing an hour or so in is that there are some small red bubbles that start to emerge, and people are starting to say, this isn't true. And what is interesting is that people are starting to offer information about why it's not true. And so what you see is that people say, hang on, that's the tiger that escaped from the zoo in Italy in 2008. It's a case of mistaken identity. It's not London. But what is interesting to us is that when that kind of information is being distributed, you see a lot of red bubbles, a lot of counterclaims, and then all of a sudden they sort of start to disappear, and a lot of the green bubbles start to take over again, and the rumor essentially starts to reproduce itself. So the claims that people are making, again, later on in the cycle, so that towards the end tail of the rumor, are simply repeating the same claim again. And what that really reminded us of is that people, of course, have particular networks on Twitter. We don't see everything. We see who we are connected to and so many steps further. So what we think happened here is that new people log on, say, oh my God, tigers have been released, quick, retweet, retweet, retweet. And the thing starts repeating itself until it's finished and the rumor dies. Now, although we didn't find any evidence of incitement, what we did find, and I think this is rather worrying, is that when the coverage of the rumor work was in The Guardian and also when the visualization came online, people started using the project hashtag to celebrate that they'd started the rumor. So people were saying, it was me. I said that about the tigers, and it made me very nervous about in future situations if people might actually start competing to get the best rumor adopted or to get the best rumor kind of picked up by some gullible researchers. So the other thing that we found was an enormous vitriol against looters. So on the one hand, we found no evidence of incitement, but what we did find is just an enormous sense of hatred and very explicit kind of statements about what these people would do to the looters. And so I think there's a real problem with this, that on the one hand, Twitter was being celebrated as, it was mainly used for positive purposes, but there was a very dark side to some of that communication as well. We looked at who actually tweeted the riots. So in terms of the 700,000 users, this is the top 10 in terms of most mentions. So this isn't necessarily how often people themselves were tweeting, but how often their accounts were retweeted or how often that account was mentioned. And what you see is that, again, the riot cleanup account has over 40,000 mentions. So this is really clearly a very, very important account during the time of the riots. We see a lot of mainstream media in there, and we see number 2, Paul Lewis, the Guardian journalist, who really was the key journalist in tweeting the riots and using social media as a platform for gathering information and so on. But we also see ordinary citizens in there, so number 8 is Local 888, who I'll come back to, and we see the Greater Manchester Police at the end. Now, Pierre, I offer my sincere apologies for this bar chart. We also built a typology of 20 different categories for how we could think about these users as groups. And one of the things that was very clear to us is that the mainstream media is really the most dominantly cited group of accounts, and followed by journalists. So mainstream media journalists were really all over Twitter. And this is also linked, of course, to how often they are being cited. So there's a lot of repetition in there. Now, the other account that I want to draw your attention to is the third most kind of mentioned category, and that's riot accounts. So one of the things that you often see in moments of crisis is that certain websites or certain users will start curating and aggregating news and filtering news for the specific purpose of making it easy for people to find information about the riots. And of course, a lot of these riot accounts were also riot cleanup accounts, so a lot of the riot cleanup in there. Now, right at the end, category 19 is spoof accounts, and I will come back to that. There were a lot of spoof accounts as well that were tweeting the riots. So just to summarize, we found a lot of mainstream media, a lot of journalists. Riot cleanup was the most mentioned individual account, but I want to also focus on the role of the emergency services, and just to highlight that Twitter was being used by lots of different users for lots and lots of different reasons. So people were organizing, people were broadcasting, people were collecting information, people were voicing opinion. So this is, for example, Local's Broom Army photograph that went viral. But what I want to move to next is people humoring the riots and people satiring rioters, the riots themselves. And what we found is that in our top 200 most cited accounts, we have these 3 massive spoof accounts that collectively are mentioned over 18,000 times. And so what is the Dark Lord doing at number 13, Lord Voldemort, having nearly 7,000 mentions in terms of his commentary on the riots? His sometimes sidekick, Professor Snape, is in there, and of course the Queen. And so what we see is a very British flavor in terms of satire and the way in which these spoof accounts were sort of tweeting and commenting on the riots. We saw a lot of satirical comments, commenting on the social situation at the time. So there was a lot of commentary on the Hackgate scandal, on Rupert Murdoch, on News International. And so one of the things that we found repeatedly, time and time again, in lots of different versions, is people saying, what is the media saying? What is the police saying? You can't get into BlackBerry Messenger. Just ask some journalists from News International. Why are you wasting your time? So there were a lot of kind of crossover comments about Hackgate and about what was going on with News International. Finally, we found people uploading images of them planking in the riots. So planking was a craze that may or may not have taken off in Switzerland, where people basically lie flat on different surfaces. And this is a planking image from the Manchester riots. So just to kind of reach my conclusions now, I think in terms of the data set we have a unique data set here. I think we need to understand a lot more about the specific context, also the local context within which this information may have had a particular relevance. The rise of the individual, I think, is really interesting here, and various other commentators have reported this. We need to better understand how rumors can be contained, how information is distributed during crisis moments. And one of the key things is, I think, the role of the police, but not just during crises, but also during everyday situations. Now, in terms of predictions, Twitter is also a listening platform. 40% of Twitter users are inactive, they listen. What happens during crisis moments? Are people more actively listening? I think we need to understand this. How can the role of the police be improved? And what is the downside of that? What is the downside of the police being on Twitter more dominantly? And how can we build further teams across disciplines, but also across sectors, to be able to respond to these kinds of events more rapidly and offer deep analysis? And where will this move next? Where will crisis communication move next? What is going to be the next platform? Is it going to be live streaming? And these are all the things that we're very interested in exploring further. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida. So it's quite interesting. Basically, what happened is the opposite of what has been reported early on by the media. So there was no incitation to violence. People were mostly against the looters. I just wanted to explain, if somebody is not familiar with Twitter, so a hashtag is a code that starts with the hash sign that you put in your message, which means I'm talking about this particular topic, so you guys could follow the tweets that were mentioning riot cleanup, which was people talking about this topic of cleaning up the riots. We had questions coming up, and somebody was wondering, like, is there a way to legally punish people who start the rumors? Is there a way to pressure them, or?
Well, I mean, I'm no legal expert, but I think the fact that people were being sent to jail for 4 years over posting an unsuccessful message on Facebook certainly raised a lot of very serious questions. I mean, I'm not familiar with the legal aspects of what happens to people when they say certain things on Twitter, but what I was certainly struck by was that there was a focus on incitement, did it happen or not, and there wasn't a focus on the vitriol and the way in which people were using very, very ugly language to suggest, you know, we'll just shoot these rioters on sites, why don't we set fire to them?
So that was actually one of your findings. The violence was against the looters.
Against the rioters, and very, very aggressively and explicitly so, what people suggested should happen to them.
A question, why do we always want to cut Twitter or Facebook? Why nobody wants to cut the mobile phones or SMS?
Well, in this case, it would have prevented a lot of problems. I think it's
why is it always the new technology we blame for everything?
It's the shock of the new. It's the shock of the new. It's the shock of the unexplained, of the unknown, and the imagination that, I think, turns it into the next boogeyman. And so I think I didn't speak about YouTube, but I mean, YouTube is another one that's often linked as a hotbed to extremism and so on. And there is no real empirical evidence to suggest that this plays this role. It's just, I think, in policy domains, there's this imagination about what social media is capable of or what it's actually doing.
What will happen in the next crisis? Do you think like David Cameron will like think twice before asking to cut Twitter, or that MP, or did you think like it was a learning experience for the whole country, and the next answer is going to be smarter, or you think actually it's really two worlds that are dividing and not coming together?
I think it was a very steep learning curve, also for us as an academic team. But I think what happened in that moment was that everyone was really, really willing to learn and do kind of scary stuff. So to work with Twitter and The Guardian and then a team of academics, I think in that innovation, something else happened that now means that we're working with the police, we're advising on their social media strategy, we're working with different government agencies, advising them on their social media strategy. And so I think what people are really aware of is that this thing, social media, is not going to go away. Twitter is not going to go away. It might go the way of MySpace at some point, but there will be a new version, there will be a new thing. And so one of the things I was really struck by is that the police is very interested in, well, how can we use this effectively during the next mega event that's going to generate a lot of tweets, and that's of course the Olympics. So that will be the next mega event that we'll be looking at.
Maybe to make them feel better, you can tell them about Anaïs's point that social media were invented
I
back
know, I will
in
put them in touch with Anaïs.
1634.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Farida
you.
Vis.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want
You
me
can
to
go
say?
this way.